Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you may be. I think today the presentation is going to be very useful for a lot of people because I think many people are wondering, why did so many people fall for what's going on? That's one of the main questions I usually get. The other question is, why didn't I fall for it? And hopefully today will enlighten you on those matters. Today's subject, I think, is very important. What I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen, go through a presentation. There will be a Q&A at the end. I think with some of these subjects, I certainly know that I had to watch short videos on some of the content numerous times before it really made its way into my mind. Without further ado, I think we will get going. Okay, if you can give me a nod, Denny, that you can see the presentation. Okay, excellent. Okay, let's get going. Okay. The effects of stealth propaganda. Really, today we're going to be dipping our toes into this subject and really learning some important information. But today really wants to be the beginning for many people to understand this. It is a complex subject, but yet a very important one. And I think those that are challenging the narrative, the more they understand about this, the more effective that they can become. Okay, reaching people. What is reaching people? Reaching people was created early on in March 2020. And it was really noticing that conversations were very strained between people with different views. There's three pillars of the project. One is conversations, one is messaging, and the other one is understanding behavior. Today, you're effectively going to see a combination of all of three of these coming into one important subject, which is the stealth propaganda. Just going to start with a little story. There's a gentleman called John Barr, who's one of the pioneers really in understanding hidden influence. And he wrote a book called Before You Know It, which is a very, very powerful book. And I think that John's got good intentions. Like many people in the field, they're not realizing that a lot of this information is being used for negative means and goals. And John relays a story that he was talking to his brother-in-law, who was actually a rocket scientist. And these gentlemen were at their log cabin and they were just getting coffee together. And John's brother-in-law said to him, he said, John, what are the new developments in social psychology? And John said, well, it's getting really interesting. We're now coming to the conclusion that probably 90% of our decisions happen unconsciously. And John's brother-in-law replied, well, that can't be, John. I can't think of a single time where I've made a decision unconsciously. And think about that. You wouldn't know because it's unconscious. And I think this is such a powerful thing that if something does occur in our mind unconsciously, then there's a good chance that we wouldn't be aware of that happening. And that is one of the main probably problems with stealth influence, is that it can happen. And if you're not aware, then it can happen without your knowledge or consent. And we're going to look into that today. So really, that can't be true. We really need to ask, is that testable? And how do we test that? Let's start by just really defining what propaganda is. Next few slides are going to have a bit of writing on them, but there won't be much writing beyond those. What is propaganda? Propaganda is the deliberate and systematic dissemination of information, ideas, or rumors to influence public opinion and shape beliefs. It is designed to manipulate people, emotions, attitudes, and behaviors by presenting information in a biased or one-sided manner. That's propaganda. A lot of the time we can see propaganda. What is stealth? The attribute or characteristic of acting in secrecy or in such a way that the actions are unnoticed or difficult to detect by others. Stealth involves moving or proceeding in a cautious, unobtrusive, and secretive manner to avoid detection. And I think it's fair to say that an awful lot of propaganda now happens in a stealth way. So put together, what we're seeing is invisible influence that can lead us to have a false sense of security about our opinions, beliefs, and knowledge. Today's really going to be a big red pill to understand how thinking works. But by understanding our vulnerability to influence, we can better protect ourselves and understand others' true intentions. It really has been it's been a very powerful process to understand this, and it's led me to change certain behaviors. It's led me to understand myself better. It really is a very enriching thing to understand. There is obviously a lot of negative stuff in there. And I don't think we're at a point in history now where we can't avoid this anymore. We need to understand it because it's really influencing billions of people on a collective level now. This is a very important quote. It isn't what we don't know that gives us trouble. It's what we know that ain't so. And that was Will Rogers. So if you believe something not to be true, then you're going to have a large problem. And I think that we've seen that in everyone's lives today, that there's many people that believe things that are clearly not true. And that leads them to really some strange behavior. It was Voltaire that said famously a few hundred years ago that if you can convince me of absurdities, then I can commit atrocities. What we know to be true is very important. What is the goal of this presentation? The goal really is to help others see the unwanted influence and enable people to equip themselves better to understand accurate information from false, understand themselves better, and build systems that serve the public and not the fat cats. If people think that they have no effect over their own control, then a lot of the time they're going to develop apathy. I think Carl Jung, really powerful quote here, the deep critical thinker has become the misfit of the world. This is not a coincidence. To maintain order control, you must isolate the intellectual, the sage, the philosopher, the savant, before their ideas awaken people. I think people are becoming aware on a scale that's never happened before in history. And I think it's a very important time to be here. I also think it's a window of opportunity that's now approaching that has never been present. So let's have a look at some examples of stealth influence. Now, I'm going to give some examples. Now, influence isn't always bad. A lot of the time it can be natural. There's some times where stealth influence is actually having a positive effect. What I'm going to show in these examples is really examples of it working. And I think it's for each person to decide the ethical, influence. And it's really a case-by-case basis. We can't say it's all good or all bad. We've really got to understand what's going on. I do think consent knowledge is very important. And I also think that there should be a large ethical, thought process that goes into any form of influence. So here's one that's very, very effective. They were looking at ways to lower people's energy use and telling them many different things had no effect, but this had a massive effect. Just telling people how much energy they use compared to their neighbors lowered the person's energy use significantly. So what you're finding is that people want to fit in and be part of the crowd. Obviously, we can say that to be kind to the planet, we want to be conscious, but we are also aware that there's so many narratives around, this whole agenda of the world, the climate, etc., that are clearly exaggerated or not true. But really, this is just showing you an example of how this one thing had an effect where so many other strategies did not work in any way. So we're massively affected by what others do. And this is not something we can avoid. It's something that's there. When people were quizzed whether this had an effect, they denied it. So this actually became a stealth influence. This next one is from Rory Sutherland's book on alchemy, called Alchemy, which is a very powerful book. I kind of like Rory. I think he's a real sort of down-to-earth Englishman. The fact that he works at an ad company, obviously, he's gonna, you've got to factor that in. But he shows here that the company he works for, they did many, many tests to see what would work. Now, in this instance, they sent out 100,000 envelopes to 400,000 people, 4 different types of request for donations. The first one was, in the donation, they put that if you tick this box, they can obviously use the tax and get 25% extra. One of them had better quality paper. One of them had the envelope in a landscape, and the other one was hand delivered. Now, if you were taught to an economist and use logic, the only one of these that should work would be the top left. All the others shouldn't have any logical reason to have more donations. But here's what actually happened. The 25% tax rebate actually reduced donations by 30%, the better quality paper actually increased donations by 10% and had a higher donation. The landscape envelope also increased donations by 10%, and the hand delivered increased donations by 10% as well. Now, those three boxes that increased donations, no economist would ever come up with those, but an ad person understood them because there's invisible forces at play. Now, in his book, Rory does kind of speculate why he thinks this happened, but the key point is that it happened. And there's a massive gap between what we predict would happen and what actually happens, because our logic cannot take into account the invisible forces that we're not aware of. And that's really important. And that's why propaganda has become so powerful, because they now understand so much more about these invisible forces. Here's another one, and the link to the science study is at the bottom. Repeating a customer's order back to them can increase tips by 68%. Okay, very powerful, that all they did was repeat the order back. This created a sense of the waiter or waitress understanding the order and therefore increased the tips. Now, I think there's a really important point here, is that if you know what works and there's a reason, become that what works. Do not pretend to be that which works. That's really the case. For instance, if being confident really has you to get respected much more in your business, then find a way to become confident. Don't pretend to be confident, because this is so much of a problem with the influence, is that people, and obviously the companies, are pretending to care rather than actually caring. And I think that's the big distinction. Now, there's thousands of examples of invisible influence. Now, I chose 3 for this part of the presentation, but I had many, many, many other ones that we could just show. The list of them is incredible. So if you imagine that in any interaction, there's hundreds of variables, and what they have done now through social psychology is manipulate those variables to find out which ones work. The institutions and the behavioral scientists have such a clear understanding of what will affect our opinions and our judgment in a more understanding way than we do. For instance, if I had said to someone, if someone spilled a coffee while in an interview, would that make you like them more? And it's called the Pratfall effect. You'd probably say no, it wouldn't have any effect. But in fact, the studies show otherwise. And it's those things that we don't think would work that do work that are really important to understand. This next one is really the one I want to point out here, is why is someone wearing a mask on their own in their own home? Now, this is an example of implicit learning. What will happen is that a lot of people that would challenge the narrative would spot that mask and think that's nonsense. But a lot of people that would look at that would not notice it. And that's really the implicit learning. That when we learn implicitly, which is a natural, very powerful way of learning, it's because there's too much information to take in any one time. So what the brain does is it takes that information in unconsciously. And that's a very powerful way, because we can process huge amounts of unconscious information and we can only process very minor amounts of conscious information. If you think about when you spot a grammar error in a sentence, a lot of the time you know it's wrong, but you might not be able to know the actual grammatical rule of why it's wrong. And that's what your unconscious mind is doing for you. It's sorting and it's understanding. The problem comes when someone can hack our unconscious, and that's really what we're going to look at. So thinking, I think what we have to do is actually reassess what thinking is. I think there's so much evidence now that thinking isn't what we were educated to think it was. There's so much more to it. And I think a large amount of it happens unconsciously. When we understand this, we get a better orientation to reality. And therefore, we become, just by nature, much more effective. For instance, also in Rory's book, he talks about logic versus psychologic. I'm going to show an example of this taken from the book, The Elephant in the Brain, which is really kind of startling. And the fact that I've mentioned that it's startling would already make you wonder about the question, which is they had a group of people that were going to go in for a heart operation that was considered fairly serious. They had compiled all the statistics on the mortality rates from this operation, from the hospitals in the particular state, I think it was in the US, and they offered this information to the patients that are about to undergo this operation. If we were to ask how many people paid the $50 fee to obtain that information, logically, we would say, well, it must be 100%. I mean, why wouldn't you pay $50 to potentially increase your survival chances by 300%? The actual amount of people that paid the $50 was 8%. Okay, that makes no logical sense. Okay, but it makes a psychological sense in that when you understand that humans are not pieces of metal, we are organisms that think and decide. So if you're building a bridge or a building or a table, then logic will serve you very well, because all the moving parts, all the variables, all the pieces involved will be visible and known. Even if you're building a bridge, the invisible forces of the wind will be measurable. When it comes to psychologic, I think the public is only just catching up to understand that there is such a thing. And if we understand it at a deeper level, then we can protect ourselves and we can actually find out really what's going on at a much deeper level. Now, what I'm going to touch on now is really what I would describe as the elusive obvious. Now, the elusive obvious was a book written by Moshe Feldenkrais, who was in movement and understanding posture, etc. And his work seems to be very powerful. But he refers to the elusive obvious as simple fundamental notions of daily life that become obscured or overlooked due to habit and routine. So if we think something and it becomes so repetitive that it goes outside of our conscious awareness, then we could be thinking something that might not be true. And I think what I want to do is use this elusive obvious to ask a few questions, which hopefully will become self-evident, that thinking isn't what we think it is. There's a much deeper level to it. Here's the first one. I chose not to be angry. Think about that. Do we really choose our emotions? Yes, people can repress them, they can try and hide them, but are emotions something that arise naturally that we become aware of rather than control or create? Because we have this thing where, you know, it comes a lot from our education, where we think we're in complete conscious control of ourselves. And this gives us, I think, a full sense of security that when we understand more accurately what's going on, I think we do get more willpower. We get more free will, as it were. To say that we have complete control of our emotions, if we're not a Zen master who has managed to master his emotions, then I think it's much better to be just honest with ourselves. He plans to fall in love at 2:30 p.m. tomorrow. That's just such a ludicrous thing to say. The way we feel about people is a naturally arising thing. It's not something we consciously decide. She decided not to feel scared of spiders or heights. Can we do that? Very difficult to do so. So things that we're scared of, when we're told, you know, when children are told, don't be scared of that, that causes a problem, because all the person's going to do is repress that fear. If that fear is there, it's there. I decided to trust this person. Again, trust isn't something you decide on. It's something that you conclude, would be my opinion. Then I will no longer feel anxious about X. So hopefully these questions will really elicit this elusive obvious, which is, when you start to think about it, it becomes self-evident that a lot of thinking is happening outside of awareness. And what happens is that we become aware of it that's going on. So we're going to look at where that comes from. But I think hopefully they are self-evident. Now, what I want to do is ask a few quite challenging ones. Now, a lot of what we do has become habit, and we continue to do it. And I know that I continue to do some things that don't work, and I, you know, bang my head against the wall and go, hang on a minute. Becoming conscious of this is really the first step. And sometimes you'll continue to do it, but it's really important. And here's the first one. If the presentation of facts does not work effectively, and there's numerous studies to show this, should we learn other ways? So when I'm at a lot of live presentations, I'll ask the audience, how well has just presenting facts to people worked over the last 4 years? Hopefully all of us here will now realize not that well. And there's many reasons for this, but that first becoming aware, oh, just presenting facts doesn't work how I thought it would work. If I call someone a sheep, will they be open to my message? Okay, that's quite obvious. But yet it doesn't stop people using that term. And it's, you have a choice. Everyone has their own way to express themselves. And I think the question is, if you're trying to reach someone, then that's probably not a good use of, language. If some people are more vulnerable to propaganda, are they conscious of their opinions? That's a very key one. Where do our opinions come from? And I think a lot of if I was to call the truth movement a collection of people with a similar outlook, we could say these people have exposed themselves to different information, and being exposed to that different information have them come to different conclusions. And I think that's the fairest way to put it. And I think that's really what's made the difference. If you're exposing yourself to information that hasn't been, the verified is obviously very problematic with the fact checkers. But if you haven't gone to some length to use discernment, then how do we really know that what we've been exposed to is true? Now, there is a huge challenge here, because when I interviewed Meryl Nash, she said the scientific studies have become so smooth and aware of people's, interpretation of them, that it's not always easy to spot the truth from the false now. So discernment is a very important thing to develop. Will my anger affect communication? Obviously, yes. And why are we so resistant to releasing anger? Anger is a very powerful emotion, and it's one of the ones that we will be most resistant to let go of. Okay, and I talk about this in a number of other presentations. So hopefully that really, just using the Socratic method there, just to ask some questions, some of them more challenging to others, to really just look inside and say, hang a minute, some of these things become obvious. If presentation of a fact does not work effectively, then should I learn other ways? And most of us should say, well, yes. And as an example, if I was to present a fact in a story versus just the raw fact, it's going to have a 30% better, 30 times more effective chance of landing. That in itself should think, well, I should be learning lots of stories about many of the narratives that counter the narrative in a non-confrontational way. And if I deliver those, then I'm going to have a much more effective, deliverance. Okay, what we're going to look at next is just what is known as Skinner's black box. This really was behaviorism that began in the sort of 60s and 70s, I think, and Skinner was one of the main proponents. And at that time, they were having difficulty studying consciousness and thought processing. There wasn't a lot of computer power, etc. So they came to the conclusion that you couldn't study what was in the unconscious mind. And therefore, what they based their studies on was creating a stimulus and then measuring the response. And therefore, a lot of propaganda and other designs of solutions use this. And for instance, they found studies on pigeons that when you created uneven rewards, it created a huge desire to consume whatever that thing was. And they adjusted the fruit machines, the pokies, etc., to use this uneven reward, and that got people addicted much more. Now, what's gone on now, I think in the last couple of decades, is that they've been able to look in the black box. Now, you can't see directly, but you can run some very clever studies to understand what's in there. For instance, they ran a study where they showed that when they gave people three sets of washing powders, and each had a very distinct box that they contained the washing powder, they measured the responses of the people. They said, which one did you prefer? And there was a predominant favoring of the first box. But what they didn't tell people was that all the washing powder was the same. So what they were able to ascertain was the actual box made a huge effect on people's decision which washing powder was better, rather than the actual washing powder. Now that enabled them to really understand much more about what's in the black box. So what would we say the black box is? I would say the black box is the engine of the mind. And what you have is you have a stimulus, an input. That stimulus might be you getting hungry, becoming aware of hunger pains. It might be that you're watching something. It might be that someone asks you a question. But then what happens is there's a load of processing that happens in your mind. And then there's an output, and that output might be a decision, it might be a thought, it might be a number of things. But when we look at memories, memories are largely unconscious. Yeah. I might say, what color was your first front door? And that memory just comes up. Was that conscious? Your mind did that for you. When you think about language, language is 99% unconscious. Every now and then you'll consciously search for a word, but generally, as I'm speaking now, I'm not consciously going into my mind and retrieving each word. I have a feeling about what I want to say, and that automatically comes up. When you're walking down the street, you don't think about how much weight to put on your left foot versus your right foot. It's automatic. And here's the most important, I think, is our judgments are almost always automatic. When you bump into someone in a lift, it's almost instantaneous. If you were to see Gates or Fauci on the TV, you've got straight away that instant sort of sick feeling about these people because of the information that's in your unconscious mind. The reason that I think that so much of the world likes Gates is because of the propaganda has been pumped out for decades about what a lovely man he is, and people haven't been aware of the real truth. When you become aware of that, your judgment automatically changes. So if we were to look in the engine of the mind, a fraction of the process in the engine of your mind is conscious. The majority of it is unconscious. If someone can mess about with the variables, like the information in your unconscious mind, then the output, i.e. the conclusions, are going to be different. One of the main points I wish to make today is that we spend most of our time challenging an output, and that has very little effect. If we were to spend most of our time on connecting the people back to their inputs or showing them information that affects their inputs, they will automatically come to a different conclusion. I spoke just briefly before the meeting today, and I said, I'm of the opinion now that most of our conclusions aren't conscious. Okay. It's about exposing yourself to good information, and then your conclusions will automatically change. I read an awful lot amount of books on this subject, and my conclusions automatically change in response to that information, which is why exposing yourself to good quality information is so important, because so much happens unconsciously. Hopefully, this will really get you thinking about thinking. And I think that's so important because it's largely something that's that we're unaware of. But when we become conscious of it, we can really protect ourselves so much better. I'm very careful now about what I watch. Some of the programs I used to like, I'm actually like, well, I can't really control my unconscious mind in watching these, so I just have to stop exposing myself to this, even though they were enjoyable. What we're going to do now is we're going to look at Joe. Now, Joe is a person that believes in the narrative, and he believes that there's a number of organizations looking after his best interests. And we're going to look at why Joe has come to that conclusion. So we're going to look at The Secret Life of Joe. This is obviously a play on the book, The Secret Life of Plants, which is a very interesting book. So let's look at this whiteboard. And this whiteboard is almost your mind's eye. It's what's in your awareness. And if I was to ask a question to guide someone's awareness, I say, what's your favorite car? Then for a lot of people, you may have instantly an image, or you may even have the question, oh, I wonder what is my favorite car? But that's coming to your conscious awareness. Your mind has done all the legwork. If I said to you, what do you think about fake news? You're going to have an understanding of that. I think the people here will have a very different understanding of fake news than the average member of the public, because of the conditioning of the term. If I asked you what 5 times 5 was, there's just going to be a little voice in your head that pops out the answer. And that's from all the, memorizing the tables as a child. Your mind is unconsciously done all the legwork for you. In Sherlock Holmes, which was one of those series that the elementary, the US one, which I really enjoyed, there's so much propaganda in that. For instance, in the episode Hounded, they have a gentleman that plays a conspiracy theorist. And this gentleman obviously is very out of shape. He has a walking stick. He's portrayed as having a very low IQ. All of those things are conditioned the public's mind to see anyone that's labeled a conspiracy theorist as being of a lower IQ, of not being someone that can critically think. So, but the public isn't second guessing what their representation of that is. And that's why that's one of the go-to phrases that you'll hear. And I think people aren't aware of that conditioning. It's quite straightforward to reverse once you know how. So really what we're saying is this conscious awareness, something is going on before these things come into someone's mind. And that's what we're going to look at. This next one is a very important slide of the project. And it's really saying that you've got Jane and Joe blocks here. Joe, we've obviously looked at, he believes in the narrative. Jane does not. She challenges the narrative. She thinks that a lot of policies don't work. And she also thinks that certain people have agendas. Now, the soapbox represents really a metaphor of our unconscious mind, okay? And what these are represented in magnifying glasses is that we will see all information via a very detailed perspective of our own. So our previous experiences will cloud, and our beliefs, our understandings will cloud any information that we see. For instance, if Jane was to place an independent journalist article that questioned the narrative in front of Joe, what would Joe's response be? It would probably be to dismiss that fact. By the same token, if Joe presented a BBC or any state-sponsored media in front of Jane, then she'd say, oh, well, that's just, propaganda. So there's such an important point to understand here that the context of the information is actually more important than the information itself. They've done numerous studies where they take a piece of information, they place it into different magazines or newspapers. Now, depending on where that is, the believability of the fact will go up significantly. So if it's been conditioned for so long that you must only trust one of the old corporate media newspapers, and each of those have to abide by Ofcom's regulations, and Ofcom says you can't print anything that says this, then what you're going to have is a filter bubble where Joe's not going to see any of that information, and therefore it won't be true to him. Now, if we look into the soapbox, we say that Joe has motivated reasoning. I think it's fair to say that most of us do. It's just a natural process of our mind. The green is information that he can not see, but it's what he believes. So consciously, he might laugh. Oh, yeah, no, I know that governments lie and institutions lie. But how does he behave? And he's probably behaving as though he trusts them. The red is information that he believes to be true, but he has conscious access to that. So really, when you look at the red and the green, there's going to be a difference that the red is what he has access to, but the green is really important because it's outside of his awareness. So he automatically thinks that anti-vax is bad. He hasn't really thought about it or what would make someone an anti-vax. So he just instantly labels them bad. He also thinks the media reports the truth. Now, it's so obvious now where the public 30 or 40 years ago used to be the clients of the media, i.e. their income came from us consuming and buying their content. So it was important to serve the public. That's no longer the case. The income now comes from advertising via large corporations or by funding by the people that own them. So you don't bite the hand that feeds you. So the media is not only bound by the governing bodies, but by what they can and can't say, by the advertisers and many other things. Sharon Atkinson wrote a very powerful book called Slanted, which really had so many examples of this. But let's look inside Jane's mind. Jane thinks that facts change people's minds. And, it's not that they don't change people's minds, but it's the fact has to make it into the person's unconscious. She knows that there's censorship. She thinks she's tried everything, but has she tested that theory? Because a lot of people say, oh, I've tried everything, but then I'll mention 3-4 things and they haven't tried them. So that's just our mind trying to make us feel better, which is a perfectly natural thing that it does. She knows that she just trusts government. She's probably read a history book, but this apathy, this is one of the biggest problems because we're going to look at this a little bit later, but where does apathy come from? It's not a conscious choice, would be my position. Now, she knows that science can be influenced just as much as anything else, but hopefully now in looking into this slide deeper, you can now see why there's such a difference of opinion between these two people, and they can sit there and throw facts at each other all day and it won't make a blind piece of difference. But if they understand where the other person's coming from and they can learn to communicate in a much more effective way, then they can affect each other. Now, obviously, Jane needs to protect herself from the unwanted propaganda, but she also needs to verify her information so that when she presents it, Joe can really have a better picture of what's going on. Typical example, if that were true, it'd be on the news. I think there's so many stories to show that's not the case if the news story affects a company's profit. So let's have a look at what's happened to Joe. Now, much like if you think about Ocean's 11, the criminals in Ocean's 11 have a mark, and then they try to make reality look a certain way. So the mark falls for thinking reality is something it's not. And this is really what's happened to Joe. So Joe has been exposed to pictures which appear to be fake because, there's many reasons why this, but they're very powerful because when you see someone dropping dead in a street, you will learn very quickly that that's something you need to be aware of because it might be important to your survival. If they fake those pictures, then obviously they're putting fake information into your mind, and that's when you come to, less than ideal conclusions. Then there was, the propaganda through the media was relentless. You had, dancing nurses, which uses a very specific way to get information in people's mind. You had certain people who had their trust is very questionable. You had pretty much in the UK everything that someone would trust aimed at them, and it was just relentless. Free donuts, that has a very effective way from a cognitive dissonance, because you think, well, I couldn't get a medical procedure because of a free donut, which forces the person to believe in the medical procedure even more. That's done unconsciously. You had all the stars come out, and if someone likes the stars, they want to mimic them and they trust them. There's no reason why they should trust them more, but that's just what happens. They feel like they know them. And then you had institutions that were funded by the very people making the products, who then just everyone towed line, really. Well, not everyone, but a vast majority of people. So if Joe's not conscious that all of this has been done intentionally, then he's just absorbing it, thinking it's true, then he's going to have some very interesting conclusions. So if we now look at the engine room as almost a hallway of mirrors, the way I like to explain it is that you would have Joe, now all the stuff on the left over here is happening unconsciously and automatically. So all of these things are happening in a split second that he's not aware of most of the time. And then what happens is when there's a stimulus, it bounces off the relevant ones, and then he ends up with a conclusion, which might be it's safe. And repetition is very important. And Jason Christoph does a great job of showing that in his presentations. I think it was Oasis that said, if you tell everyone you're the best band in the world, and people will start to believe you. So that safe and effective was just drummed thousands of times. There was no substance to it. There was no, real good study showing people that was the case, but then people just believed it. And then that was it. It just became a belief. And you ask them, what leads you to that? And then they would then grapple for reasons. There was obviously the reframing of, if you get really sick, it means it's working. I mean, think about that. How crazy that would be. But you see, people's responses were really managed. Now, Jane's is really important because you think about the inputs here, the apathy, the confidence, the difficult nature of what's going on, the various narratives, her own judgments, her own motives, and then she comes up potentially, what can I do? If we think that's our conclusion, then we're going to think that's the result. But what if that's not our true nature? What if we've been led to believe that? And I had lunch with a scientist last year who had done so much great work, and she said, oh, I've just had enough. I'm not making any effect. I'm going to give up. That is the perfect conclusion that someone that wanted to control you would want you to come to. So hopefully now, if you look at this slide, you really get a sense of how, with enough propaganda, enough smooth, invisible influence, that you can affect someone's mind and how done on a large scale that you can get people believing things that might not be true. So the first thing I'd say is don't watch TV, and most people in the truth movement do not. And I think that's why they're very much more aware than the average person. Now, I would highly recommend people watching this. Now, this is a video that I put in an article following the interview I did with Tess Lowry. And in that article, it's got the link to it. And there's many other very important links there. What Darren Brown does is he talks to two executives of advertising agency, and he says, I want you to come up with a slogan and a name, etc. And what happens is that they come up with almost identical to what he predicted. And what he does is he just puts loads of information into their environment that leads them to those conclusions, but they are completely unaware. So that's really important. And hopefully now you can really start to see how stealth influence can be very real, but how it's also just there constantly. Now, what I want to just finish on is just one thing, which is the big picture, which is if you think about the busiest station that you know, could be, King's Cross or Grand Central in New York or whatever, and you're on the balcony and you look down and you look at people during rush hour, it looks like chaos. But what you're not going to realize is that every single person has a purpose and they have a direction and a place that they want to get to. Even if they're lost, they have a goal, they're going somewhere. If you knew what drove those people to go to those places and you could influence that, then you can create control on a huge scale. If those people did not know that you were controlling them, then they would have this illusion of free will. And I think this is really a really important metaphor to understand, is that that's where stealth propaganda and stealth influence really is. It's the ability to affect huge amounts of people by understanding the variables at play. Things like if you create roadworks everywhere, then people are going to want to drive less. If you're going to make it really difficult to farm, then there's going to be less farmers. If you're going to, if they're, suddenly lots of food processing plants catch a light, you're going to have other problems. So it's really this indirect influence that I think is massively important. And when you start, and I'm probably going to run a presentation on this, the control room, because when you understand the variables at play, people can actually create huge amounts of influence. And those that, manipulate the commodities markets and everything else, they know how to do this. So really, in summary, we want to ask ourselves now, what is stealth propaganda? Well, hopefully it should be obvious now that it's information that makes it into our mind that we're not aware is going into our mind. Hopefully this really key point, input versus outputs. Don't challenge a person's conclusion. You've got to meet them where they are. But if you connect them back to the inputs via the Socratic method, or you use metaphor and story to get different information into their mind, they are going to come to different conclusions. Can control and influence be carried out on a grand scale? Well, I think that answers itself. And I think now you have a lot more understanding of how this happens, even though we've just dipped our toe in the water. So now you now hopefully know more than you did before this presentation started. And just the wealth of information that's there is kind of incredible. So bringing it to a conclusion, for further information, you can see reachingpeople.net, or you can email me info@reachingpeople.net.